Sarah Johnson, one of the city's leading businesswomen, heard the unthinkable: a dissatisfied customer at her chain of five-star hotels. Shocked, she decided to do the unthinkable. She disguised herself as a homeless woman and entered one of her own hotels, wanting to find out the truth. Were the luxury and respect just a facade? Sarah Johnson was always the kind of woman who controlled everything around her. No detail went unnoticed, especially when it came to her chain of luxury hotels. She knew every corner, every employee, every dish served, or at least she thought she did. That afternoon, as the sun hid behind the tall buildings of New York, Sarah held a simple envelope. It was thin, discreet, but the weight it carried bothered her more than any other problem she had faced in business. Inside was a customer complaint. Nothing out of the ordinary for many companies, but for Sarah's hotels, this was something serious. And this complaint, in particular, was different. The customer wasn't just complaining about one detail or another. They were saying in so many words that the service at the hotel was substandard, which for Sarah was almost a personal insult. She felt a pang in her chest as she read it again. Could it be that they were failing and no one had told her? Were her managers always so full of praise, hiding something? The thought that perhaps her network was decaying and she hadn't noticed made her uneasy. She stood up, pacing back and forth in her office. The marble floor felt colder than usual under her feet. Sarah felt that control, something she had always cherished, was slipping through her fingers. She trusted her team, of course, but how could she guarantee that each one of those employees, spread across dozens of hotels, would maintain the level of excellence she preached so much? Insecurity began to take hold. She knew that something had to be done quickly. She couldn't just send in another supervisory team or read well-written reports from managers. No, she needed to see for herself. And that's when the idea came to her. She would disguise herself. Yes, she would pass herself off as a person without resources, someone no one would recognize. She would check into one of her own hotels like any other person who, apparently, is penniless. The idea took her by surprise. She, a woman who always wore the best, who walked with class, would now become a stranger, someone the staff would look down on. But this was necessary. It was the only way to find out what was really going on. Sarah knew that the true face of a business appeared when no one was looking, when customers were not recognized. And she needed to see that. She needed to understand whether the compliments she was hearing were sincere or just a facade. As she decided on her plan, a mixture of fear and determination overwhelmed her. Will I make it? Will I be able to stand seeing my own employees treating me like nothing? The insecurity she hadn't felt in a while returned with force. But she had no choice. If her hotel chain was going under and she didn't realize it, the price would be even higher. The next morning, Sarah would get ready, and with a disguise that she herself would barely recognize, she would enter the heart of her empire as a complete stranger. The next morning, Sarah barely recognized her own image in the mirror. The elegant woman, always impeccable, now saw herself in dirty, worn-out clothes, her hair tied up in any way, and her face devoid of makeup. She felt a tightness in her chest. Never in her life had she thought she would have to disguise herself like this. But there she was, ready to enter her own hotel as someone completely invisible. When she reached the hotel door, Sarah hesitated for a moment. The lobby, which had so often welcomed her with smiles and compliments, now seemed distant, almost intimidating. She took a deep breath and entered, feeling the eyes immediately turn to her. They weren't the warm gazes of before, but quick, up and down, assessing looks, immediate discomfort. She already knew it would be difficult, but being in the shoes of someone despised was much heavier than she had imagined. She went straight to reception, where a young man was sitting, eyes fixed on his computer screen. He didn't even raise his head when Sarah stopped in front of him. She had to hiss to get his attention. When he finally looked up, his gaze was cold, impersonal. "Right?" he asked without any sympathy in his voice. Sarah asked for a room, trying to keep calm, but the answer came quickly and without consideration. "We're full," said the receptionist as he turned his eyes back to the screen, as if she wasn't even there. The hotel was almost empty, and Sarah knew it. The lobby, spacious and luxurious, was silent, with few guests circulating. Even so, she was dismissed with cruel ease. "Full," he said. Just like that. She stood there for a second, processing the indifference. It couldn't be that it was like that for every customer, could it? Was it just because she was undercover? There was no doubt about it. It wasn't about booking policy. It was something much simpler and crueler. Appearance. That receptionist didn't even bother to check. Before I could ask, he pointed to a small waiting room. You can wait there. There might be a dropout. No courtesy, no explanation. Sarah, who had always prided herself on training her staff to offer the best, felt a lump in her throat. She was being treated as if she were a nuisance, a stumbling block. As she made her way to the waiting room, she noticed the stark contrast. While the other guests were greeted with smiles, drinks, and comfort, she was shoved into a modest, almost hidden room, as if her presence there was a mistake. She sat on a hard chair with her back to the main movement of the hotel, and for the first time, began to feel the contempt that many must have felt there, in their own hotel. He looked around, observing how the staff moved through the lobby. The conversations, the laughter, the exchanges of glances with other well-dressed guests. She was nothing more than a figure they preferred not to see. Sitting in that isolated waiting room, Sarah watched the movement of the lobby. The physical discomfort of the old clothes and the cold environment was the least of her problems. What really bothered her was the way she was being treated. There, invisible, she saw something she had never imagined she would find in her own hotels. For the first time, Sarah wasn't the powerful, influential woman that everyone rushed to please. She was just another one, or worse, someone the staff preferred to ignore. From where she stood, she could see everything. A well-dressed couple walked through the front door, and within seconds, the receptionist who had snubbed her was greeting them with a huge smile. It was as if they were longtime friends, offering welcome drinks and a quick check-in. Sarah watched every gesture, every word laden with attention and courtesy. It was clear that the problem was there, right in front of her eyes. It wasn't the hotel's policy, it wasn't isolated mistakes. It was a clear contempt for those who didn't seem to have money. She saw how rich guests were treated with respect, while she barely got a glance. A bitter feeling began to grow inside her. Everything she had built up with so much effort, all the standards of excellence she had always demanded, were being broken right there in front of her. What made matters worse was that the staff not only ignored her, but made a point of showing their contempt. Sarah began to hear low laughter coming from reception. They were laughing at her. Some staff exchanged glances and whispered, pointing in the direction of the room where she was. They didn't try to disguise it. To them, she was nobody, just a woman dressed in rags, sitting alone in a corner, waiting for something that would probably never come. Every second, the feeling of invisibility grew. Those who were supposed to be trained to welcome all guests were showing the exact opposite. The contempt for those who seemed inferior was evident in every movement, in every muffled laugh that reached her. Sarah felt the weight of the silence around her. Seeing it hit her in a way she hadn't expected. She had always thought that she knew how her hotels worked, that her staff followed the hospitality policy she preached. But now, in front of that scene, she saw the true face of the place she had built. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't welcoming, and above all, it wasn't fair. The lobby, which had once been the symbol of the luxury she offered the world, now looked like the stage for a cruel play, where those without money were relegated to the background, while those who seemed rich were treated like kings. Sitting in that isolated room, Sarah began to feel the real weight of her decision. The physical discomfort, the contempt she was receiving, all this was eating away at her patience and her confidence. It was hard to believe that this was her hotel, built by her hands and based on the values she had always believed in. But at that moment, she was just a figure that everyone preferred to ignore. She had been there for hours when something unexpected happened. A simple-looking man wearing the uniform of the cleaning staff approached. He didn't seem to be in any hurry, unlike the others who avoided her at all costs. With a quick glance, Sarah noticed the name tag, Mike. He was holding a coffee on a worn plastic tray. "You look tired here, take it," he said, offering the cup with a discreet but genuine smile. Sarah hesitated for a moment, surprised. This gesture of courtesy was the first she had received since entering the hotel. She took the glass, almost speechless. Mike's hand was firm, but his gaze was that of someone who knew much more than he let on. He didn't ask why she was there, nor did he make jokes or insinuations like the others. He just offered her coffee, and Sarah felt something she hadn't expected in that environment: respect. Mike leaned against the wall next to her, holding the mop, looking at ease as if the scene was completely natural. "It's funny how some people here only look at their clothes, isn't it?" he said casually, but with a truth that hit Sarah hard. He wasn't just cleaning up. He was seeing things. Mike watched what was going on backstage. He knew what she was going through, even if he didn't understand who she really was. They were silent for a moment, but that silence wasn't uncomfortable. On the contrary, it was the first time since Sarah had entered that hotel that she hadn't felt invisible. Mike didn't judge her. He didn't look down on her. He just treated her like someone, a person who deserved respect. When he finally started to walk away, with his cleaning trolley creaking on the floor, Sarah felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. Relief at having, even for a brief moment, felt a modicum of humanity. And sadness at realizing that, at the end of the day, it was simple people like Mike who still kept the values she preached alive. Mike disappeared down the corridors, leaving Sarah standing there, holding her coffee and wondering how things had come to this. Even though the gesture was small, the impact was enormous. The contrast between the coldness of the other employees and Mike's genuine simplicity made her wonder what was really wrong. There was something deeper there, something that couldn't be solved by training or rules alone. After her unexpected meeting with Mike, Sarah felt a brief surge of hope, but she knew there was still a lot to discover. With a tightness in her stomach and a slight headache from everything she had seen so far, she decided to go to the hotel restaurant. At that time of day, there should be few customers, which would allow her to observe more closely how she was treated. As she entered, she immediately felt the air was heavy, unlike the other times she had been there as the hotel's owner, greeted with smiles and reserved tables. This time, the maitre d' glanced at her, and his expression of surprise soon turned to discomfort. Without saying a word, he led her to a secluded table at the end of the hall, away from the other customers, almost as if he were hiding his presence. Sitting at that table, Sarah could see everything clearly. The few customers who were there were attended to with all possible attention. Each dish served was accompanied by smiles, recommendations from the chef, and small kindnesses that were part of the service she always preached. She noticed how the tables closest to the entrance received constant attention from the waiters, who offered drinks, described dishes enthusiastically, and even asked if there were any adjustments to the order. With her, it was a different story. Sarah waited and waited. No one came to ask if she needed anything. No one offered a menu. When a waiter finally appeared, he did so in a hurry, without even making eye contact. He just left the menu on the table anyway and left quickly. There were no suggestions for dishes, no polite words, nothing. She just sat there, as if she didn't exist. The restaurant, which had always been a source of pride for Sarah, now looked like a theater where only the rich and well-dressed received applause. She looked around and saw the stark difference in treatment. Every second felt like a stab in the pride she carried for her work. It wasn't just the service, it was contempt, disdain for the appearance of someone they thought was unimportant. When his order finally arrived, the dish was cold, poorly prepared, lifeless food without the care that should be standard. She knew more than anyone that this restaurant offered the best in haute cuisine, but not for her, not for someone they considered insignificant. The bitter taste of the cold food matched the bitterness growing inside her. She tried to eat, but indignation and sadness took over. It was as if everything she had built was falling apart before her eyes. Her employees, the ones she trusted to represent the best in hospitality, were failing her. Not just failing, but disrespecting everything she believed in. From her secluded table, Sarah continued to observe. She saw customers being greeted with glasses of wine, while she could barely get a glass of water. She saw smiles and kindnesses being distributed generously to others, while her presence was an uncomfortable shadow in the corner of the room. It was impossible to ignore what was happening. Discrimination, prejudice, contempt for those who seemed to have no money. There, in her own restaurant, the truth of unequal treatment was visible, cruel and relentless. That evening, Sarah didn't need to finish her meal to realize that the situation was much more serious than she had imagined. She was in the middle of a reality that could no longer be denied, and what she saw in the restaurant confirmed her worst fears. The respect and excellence she demanded so much was only being offered to those who seemed to deserve it. After the bitter experience in the restaurant, Sarah felt she needed to test every aspect of the hotel. She knew that if there were flaws in the basic service, it was likely that the leisure areas, where her guests paid dearly for the luxury experience, would also be compromised. With this in mind, she decided to try to access the pool and spa. That's where customers usually relaxed, and the hospitality service should be impeccable. As she approached the pool, her first suspicions were confirmed. As soon as she entered the area, disapproving looks came her way before any words were spoken. One of the pool attendants, making no effort to hide his disdain, approached with slow steps, looking Sarah up and down, as if it was a mistake for her to be there. The discomfort was almost palpable. "Can I help you?" he asked, but there was no sympathy in his voice, only contempt disguised by a thin layer of formality. Before Sarah could even answer, he continued, "The pool area is exclusively for guests, the better off." The words were carefully chosen, but the meaning was clear. She didn't look like she belonged there. In that instant, Sarah realized that it wasn't just a flaw in one sector or another of the hotel. Prejudice ran deep, rooted in the way each employee viewed guests. If you didn't look like you had money, you weren't welcome. Still, Sarah stood there for a few minutes, watching in silence. She saw how guests who appeared wealthier were greeted with clean towels, cold drinks, and strategically placed sun chairs. Every detail, every gesture, was meticulously calculated to please the clients they deemed important. For her, none of this was on offer. There wasn't a towel, a comfortable chair, or even a smile. She was a stranger there, invisible. Feeling the weight of rejection, Sarah decided to try the last part of the hotel she wanted to evaluate, the spa. One of the most luxurious places in the hotel, known for its cutting-edge treatments and personalized service, had always been Sarah's pride. If there was one place where the service had to be impeccable, it was there. When she arrived, the spa receptionist looked at Sarah with a mixture of suspicion and surprise, as if she had no right to be there. Her words came out quickly, without any attempt to disguise her apathy. "Bookings for the day are full. We have no times available." Sarah knew it was a lie. That time slot was never full, and she had checked availability online before leaving home. However, the woman didn't even bother to check the system. The judgment was instantaneous. There, she was just a person with no resources, no importance. Watching from the corner, Sarah saw other guests arrive at the spa and were greeted with warm smiles. They were offered a variety of treatments, and the receptionist spared no effort to ensure that everything was perfect. The difference in treatment was clear, painful, and every second she spent there only reinforced the truth that was already becoming obvious. Hospitality, real hospitality, was not for everyone. After being rejected yet again, Sarah tried the last area, the bar, a place frequented by guests who wanted to relax and enjoy exclusive cocktails, always with the best service. As soon as she entered, the bartender caught a glimpse of her and without hesitation went over to her. But instead of offering her the menu or asking what she would like to drink, he simply informed her in a dry voice that the bar was reserved for guests who were part of a special club. Of course, she didn't belong to that club. She didn't belong to anything there. With nothing else to do, Sarah left. The last few hours had been harder than she could have imagined. Every rejection, every gesture of contempt showed that her empire of luxury and excellence was deeply contaminated. What she saw in the leisure areas confirmed everything she had feared. The service she so valued was a privilege reserved only for those who seemed to have money. Reality was staring her in the face, and she knew she could no longer ignore it. Back in the small, impersonal room they had given her, Sarah sat on the bed, her legs heavy from walking around the hotel, and her mind even more exhausted than her body. Everything she had witnessed so far was suffocating her, but she knew that the worst was yet to come. She needed to confront management. She needed to see with her own eyes whether the leadership of the place, which she herself had put in charge, was aware of the poison that was running among the employees. The next day, Sarah went to the management office not knowing exactly what to expect. She knew that Mr. Thompson, the hotel's general manager, only knew her from formal meetings, from afar. They had never interacted closely, but at that moment, disguised as an external consultant, he would receive her with suspicion. On entering, the atmosphere already seemed charged with tension. The office, which had once exuded the authority and efficiency of a large hotel, now seemed stuffy, with papers piled up on the desks and a certain disorder in the air. Thompson greeted her with a distant look, sitting behind his desk with a rigid posture, but not one of respect, of indifference. "So you're here to evaluate our service, right?" he asked, his voice dry and uninterested, as he arranged the papers in front of him, as if what he was about to discuss was of no great importance. Sarah nodded, with a calm she barely felt. She began to ask questions, all carefully formulated to gauge the extent of Thompson's commitment to the quality of the hotel. She wanted to know how he trained his staff, how he dealt with guest complaints, and what he considered the standard of excellence at the place. The answers came, but each one sounded like a stone in Sarah's heart. Thompson spoke with disinterest, always bringing up numbers and targets. It was as if the quality of service wasn't part of the equation. He highlighted the good financial results, the increase in bookings, and mentioned some awards the hotel had received. Each answer focused on maintaining the image, on ensuring that the hotel remained profitable. Service, the actual guest experience, seemed to be just an annoying detail. Sarah pressed him with specific examples, still without revealing that she had experienced everything firsthand. "And how do you deal with guests who don't appear to have money? Do they get the same attention as the others?" Thompson avoided the question, looking away and mentioning the hotel policy, as if that solved everything. He continued to defend the image, the profitability. There was no empathy in his words, just numbers and a frightening detachment. At that moment, Sarah realized that the problem was much deeper than she had imagined. Thompson, the man who was supposed to be the face of the hotel's excellence, saw guests as numbers. He talked about people as if they were just data to be analyzed in spreadsheets, and this inevitably had spread to the other employees. As the conversation unfolded, the frustration inside her grew. Sarah felt the weight of disappointment sinking into her shoulders. It wasn't just the behavior of grassroots staff. It was an entire culture that was rotting, a culture that she had inadvertently allowed to grow under her eyes. Mr. Thompson kept talking, defending his metrics and financial targets, while Sarah already knew the truth. He was part of the problem, perhaps the main part, and as a manager, he had the power to change that. But he wasn't doing it. Maybe he didn't even want to. For him, appearances and numbers were everything. When the conversation ended, Sarah left the office with a tightness in her chest. The confrontation had been revealing, but painful. She knew it wouldn't be easy to change what was ingrained there, because Thompson wasn't the only one. The entire leadership seemed more concerned with profits than with people. She had just come out of a silent war, where the truth was exposed, and now, the road to change seemed more challenging than ever. After leaving Mr. Thompson's office, Sarah walked slowly through the hotel corridors. With every step, the weight of disappointment accompanied her. She knew that the problem wasn't just in the smiling faces of the receptionists or the selective service of the waiters. The evil was at its roots. And now, after seeing the lack of commitment from management, she needed to understand the extent to which this was affecting staff morale. Undercover, she began to observe more closely the behavior of those who made the hotel work behind the curtains. The tired looks, expressions of discontent, and whispers in the corridors said much more than any formal report. Something was deeply wrong there. The silence among the employees wasn't just that of someone who was busy. It was the silence of those who had given up. Determined to go further, Sarah found a way to talk to some employees as an external consultant, looking to improve the working environment. What she heard, however, only confirmed her worst fears. One receptionist, who initially hesitated to speak, revealed her frustration with the way she was treated. She said that the training sessions were quick and superficial, and that she was often forced to follow rules that even she didn't believe in. "They tell us to treat everyone the same, but in practice, we know who should be prioritized," she confessed, with the lost look of someone who had already accepted the routine of contempt as something normal. Demotivation was in every word, And the tiredness wasn't just physical. Sarah also spoke to a waiter at the restaurant, who wasn't surprised to hear that less well-off guests received inferior treatment. We do what we're told, but it's become automatic. If the customer doesn't seem to matter, why bother? He said with a bitter laugh that hid a painful truth. That wasn't a hotel, it was a machine. And the employees, worn out and undervalued, were parts. With each conversation, the picture became clearer. Productivity targets, a focus on results, and a lack of recognition were draining the passion and respect that should exist in the workplace. Disorganization came from the top, and the result was a group of employees who followed orders without any enthusiasm or purpose. They weren't treated as important, so how could they treat guests with importance? It was then that Sarah decided to speak again to Mike, the cleaning staff member who, even in the midst of that storm of indifference, had been the only person to treat her with dignity. He, more than anyone, seemed to understand what was going on there. She found him in one of the corridors in the middle of his daily routine, pushing the cleaning trolley. "There's a lot wrong here, isn't there?" she asked bluntly. Mike looked at her for a moment, then nodded. "A lot. We see it. But what can we do? They don't listen." He didn't need to say any more. The truth was evident in the weariness in his voice. Mike, like many others, knew what was wrong. He knew that guests were treated unequally and that management only cared about numbers. He knew that the problem lay at the top, and like the others, he had learned to accept it. Before leaving, Mike offered one last observation. "There are a lot of good people here, but they're tired. We just wanted someone to really see us." These words echoed in Sarah's mind as she walked back to her room. The staff were invisible, just as much as the guests she herself had witnessed being snubbed. Sarah knew that in order to change the culture of the hotel, she would have to fight something much bigger than the indifference of the staff or Thompson's mismanagement. She would have to restore faith in both staff and guests that every person, no matter how they look, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. The road would be long, painful, and full of resistance. But now more than ever, Sarah was determined to transform what she had seen.